Hi, everyone, and welcome again to another episode of GaudiMetzBez22.com Podbean podcast and YouTube video. Just a quick note, I've got a few podcasts coming up. Did one yesterday with Rodney Hauser and Rachel Coleman. That'll be posted soon as well. But today I'm joined yet again by yet another repeat victim, as I like to call them, a repeat victim of my podcast, Dr. Daniel Drain, who is the director. Oh, geez. I'm having a senior moment. You just told me 10 seconds ago, but why don't you just tell us what your title is?
Sure. Sure. Larry, thanks again excuse me, Dr. Chapp. Thank you for having me.
You can call me
Um,
Larry.
sure. So I'm the director of the Office for Life and Family for the Archdiocese of Philadelphia. I'm also at the gracious favor of your lovely wife, Dr. Carmina Chapp, an adjunct professor at St. Charles Borromeo Seminary.
Well, that's right. Those who know me know that my wife is dean of the division of the ongoing theological studies there. She's not dean of the seminary, but of their program that for masters and so forth for non-seminarians, which she runs. She ran it a long time ago too, and took some time away as we started the farm, and now she is back, and
He's back. She's in
she's
power.
she she has power, man, power, both there and, oh, good heavens, at home as well. So let's just put it that way, but in a good way, in a good way. What else was I going to say? Oh, and you got your PhD at the John Paul II Institute for Studies on Marriage and Family in Washington, D.C. And you wrote on Balthasar, and that's the topic of today. But before we get to the topic of today, which is Balthasar, his theological unpacking of the idea that there is a kind of kenosis within God or kenosis within God, I have to take note. There was a recent article about you in I think it was the Philadelphia newspaper. The headline said that you were Philadelphia's drain.
Yeah, I think I may have upset someone in our communications office. It's hard when your last name is a noun. Yeah, I was named to a national council for the USCCB, and the headline started with Philadelphia's drain named to. Uh, we've
Yeah.
no end to laughing about that in my house. Yeah.
Somebody needs, sometimes headlines are just absurd in the way they get worded. And obviously, someone there at the paper didn't catch the fact that Philadelphia's drain could be taken in.
I kind of hope they did. I kind of hope they have it out for me, and it was a subtle, clever dig.
Yeah,
That would
that you're
be
you're just the drain, and maybe you need some Drano get unclogged with Philadelphia drain unclogged.
Oh, I've heard it all.
All right, all right. Let's get to it. And for those, excuse me, I am suffering from a little bit of either allergies or a cold. So if you hear a lot of throat clearing, then you'll know why. And my voice is a little weak today too. At any rate, we are discussing today a very, very important topic. I'm currently in the midst of continuing to write what I call the hermeneutics of kenosis, and I had the third installment of that a couple weeks ago, which I wasn't really happy with, but it was kind of foundational and said some things that needed to be said. But the next installment is going to be far more substantive, and I'm working on it now. But the topic of kenosis is very, very important to me in Balthasar. And in a couple weeks or next week, I'm doing an interview with Rodney Hauser and Caitlin Gilson on this same topic
Oh,
because
why are
they're
you
both.
talking to me then? She's Lady Wisdom. That's the way to go.
She rocks, man. She's amazing. I had her on a couple of weeks ago with Hauser, and we just had a raucously good time. But anyway, you're no slouch yourself. Freshly minted PhD not too long ago on the
Mhm.
topic. So let's get into for let's just begin with a basic definition. What
Yeah.
the word kenosis is a Greek word used by St. Paul in his famous hymn in Philippians, where he says, Christ, though he was in the form of God, did not deem equality with God something to be clung to or grasped at, but rather he emptied himself and took on the form of a slave. Now, that word emptied, kenos, is in Greek kenosis, but obviously it means a lot of different things. So, what would you say is Balthasar's definition of kenosis?
Hmm. Balthasar, I think, I think what I'm comfortable saying overall, there are a couple elements of it that he'll go on to highlight, especially when he's trying to sort out what we can mean when we say it in theology versus how it's been spoken of in process philosophy and 19th century German movements and so on. I think for him, it really is the language of gift and of self-gift. And that may seem like a sort of modern imposition, especially from the pontificate of John Paul II, this emphasis on the language of gift. But to pour oneself out is not to give some particular thing or to perform some one single isolated action, but it's more like an oblation to offer parody of what you are, which for the human being entails not just the moment of gift, but the sort of continual giving of that gift. And that's why that language of pouring out or emptying has this dynamic, directed sense to it of whatever I am is going to be given for the sake of this. I wanted to point out too, and I only know this because on the tabernacle at the parish where my family and I frequently go, it's written in Greek from John's Gospel, hologosarx egeneto chai eskenosen en chemin. The word became
Was
flesh
made
and dwelt
flesh.
among us. But the Greek for dwelt among us is eskenosen, which comes from that root for emptied. So that's why I think I'm most comfortable using that language of gift or oblation because it's about becoming something which belongs to another. So to hand oneself over. But yeah, the classic or text is from Philippians, from Second Philippians. Yeah. But
Yes.
emptied himself, that's the NRSV. There's a couple other ways it's translated.
Yeah, and but what's critical there in the line with your definition of it is largely meaning an oblation of the entire self, a gift of the entire self for the sake of the other, however we define the other. That Paul says, he emptied himself, took on the form of a slave, and that is in contrast to the fact that he was in the form, if you will, of God, which meant that he was essentially of divine status. Paul's not anticipating Nicaea here, but there's clearly an implication at the very least that Christ is
Yeah,
identified in some way with divinity, and that therefore there can't be any contradiction. And this is implied in Paul's theology here in Philippians. There's no competition, there's no contradiction here between who God is in himself, who Christ is in the heavenly domain, and in the economy of salvation, him taking on a human nature, which Paul interprets as taking on the form of a slave. And that is something that I think quite often gets ignored
mhm,
by exegetes of this passage as one of the deeper metaphysical theological implications that Paul is hereby saying that God ad extra in the economy of salvation really is revealing to us who God is ad intra, and those are not, and that is kenotic.
that's right. That's right. Yeah, and I think where this gets tricky and why both preachers and theologians shy away from kind of a too metaphysical a reading of kenosis that's too metaphysical is because there's a fear that when we speak in the language of self-emptying and pouring out, it's also loaded with our experience of it really costs me something, and there's not enough of me there when I do that. Only grace can supply what I really give. And so there's a fear of taking this human experience of self-emptying and applying it to the Trinity because it implies in some sense the language of zero sum. And so that has to be transformed, it has to be expanded and the guardrails from the language of the analogy of being have to be put up, but it can be done. But that's, I think, largely why folks shy away from it.
Yeah,
When,
go
sorry,
ahead.
go ahead.
No, I'm just pointing out that I think that's very true. John Betts, the Notre Dame theologian, his latest book, The Logos of Creation, there's a chapter in there. It's a book on Christology and the use of the concept of analogy within Christological construction, because Betts is an expert in the Polish philosopher Chavara, who was all about the analogy of being, which Balthasar drew heavily on as well. Anyway, I don't want to go down that rabbit hole, but Betts, in a chapter in there called On the Humility of God, which is directly related to kenosis, you may or may not have read his book, or at least that chapter. Margaret Turek showed it to me. That he notes that there are strong Thomistic objections to interjecting kenosis, as Balthasar does, into God. And they would want to limit the kenotic elements of the incarnation to merely the economy of salvation, but that particular aspect of the economy, the divine humility, the divine kenosis, is not at all indicative of who God is ad intra. And of course, they appeal to St. Thomas Aquinas, who says that God cannot have humility in this very narrow definition that Aquinas gives of humility, because there is no one to whom God should be, towards whom God needs to be humble. And therefore, we can't say, and yet a closer reading of Aquinas will show in his Trinitarian theology in particular, and some other, that Aquinas comes very close to saying that we can say certain things about God out of the economy of salvation. Anyway, maybe you have a comment on that.
No, I was just going to say because I have read that chapter. It's amazing, and I was able to spend a little bit of time with Dr. Betts in the fall at a conference. And what strikes
Was
me,
that the De Nicola?
no, this was a collaboration with the Dietrich von Hildebrand project. It was a conversation
Okay,
with
yeah, I
Walter.
couldn't make that. I was invited to that, but couldn't make it.
That's right. That's
Uh,
right. You were supposed to be there. Yeah.
yeah,
I
yeah.
think
Anyway.
I think I was your pinch hitter. In fact.
Well, a hell of
Uh,
a pinch hitter, probably have a higher
that's right.
batting average than I do. So, yeah.
But what strikes
Anyway,
me about Dr. Betts's tone in particular in those conversations, because he knows that to go toe to toe with the Thomistic tradition of interpretation is always, that's an article generating thing. But John's concern is that, look, there are ways of explaining the mystery that leave room open for it to disclose something to you further. And his fear, I think, is that the Thomistic interpretation, I'll just leave that very broad, the Thomistic interpretation of things like kenosis actually evacuate um, a straightforward reading of what Paul is saying, of its integral meaning, and that a reading that you get from Shavara or Balthasar actually accounts for more of what's there in the scripture. Paul seems to not be leaving a sort of exception there. There's a parallel between the morphe theo and the morphe doulo, the form of God and the form of a slave. And precisely what's disclosed there in Philippians, I think, Balthasar, I think, thanks, is that the way of possessing that form of God is to deem it as something that can't be grasped. And precisely it's an expression of that godliness to not grasp and to take on the form of another. And so there's this sort of self-dispossession for the sake of the existence of the other. And that if Paul's saying anything, he's at least saying that that phenomenon, which we've seen in the person of Christ in the Paschal mystery, has its source in whatever's going on in God.
yeah,
And there's ways to explain that make it impossible to take that leap,
yeah.
or make it very difficult to mean what's implied there.
Yeah, my last blog entry on the hermeneutics of kenosis, part three, was inspired by John Betts's article. I've tried to get Betts on the show, but he's such a shy and humble and reserved guy. He's
Yeah.
not a podcast guy, is what he said. I saw him at Notre Dame. He goes, "Oh gosh, Larry, you know how he is. He's so humble. Oh, that would just be such an honor. But you should get somebody far better than I to, to do that, because I'm terrible at that. Oh, geez, John Betts, if you're listening, I need you on this show." But such a great book. But you're right. He's so irenic towards the Thomists. And by the way, we need to be very clear about something. There are various schools of Thomism. So, I mean, we don't want to say all Thomists are opposed to Balthasar, because that's on this point of kenosis, because I don't think that's true. But there is a strong element within modern Thomistic circles that view Balthasar's use of the categories of kenosis and descent that he gleans from the economy of salvation. They're very suspicious. They see that he's interjecting into God darkness, uh, even perhaps suffering in a way that would imply passibility and compromises God's impassibility. And I think that behind the paywall, if you will, what they're most concerned with is that notion of divine impassibility, because they don't know how to reconcile these elements of the economy of salvation with the notion of divine impassibility. So and Betts is very erratic, but it's very clear where he comes down. And it's what you just said, that if we follow that to its logical conclusion, it really drives a wedge between the economy of salvation and who God is ad intra. And it also then sort of evacuates huge parts of Scripture. All that being said, then, which I know you already know and agree with, why don't you do now a deep dive into
Sure.
Balthasar's Trinitarian theology so we can see, and maybe in that answer, differentiate where Balthasar's use of kenosis in describing the Trinitarian relations differs from that of some of the Russian Sophiologists like Bulgakov, who he's very, very influenced by, but
Right.
at the end of the day, distances himself from certain elements of that Russian Sophiology. Anyway, that's a mouthful,
Yeah.
but go ahead, Dan.
I'll do my best. So let me name two resources and or people you should just have on to talk about this too. One I know you know already, which is Jennifer Newsom Martin's book on Hans Urs von Balthasar and the critical appropriation of Russian religious
Great
thought.
book. Great book. I had her on the show talking about it.
It's so good. She's got a chapter that most of it is devoted to specifically the excesses of Russian sophiology and whether or not they're purified when Balthasar takes them up. She thinks there is, but it's worth noting. Anyway, that's a tremendous book, and one you may not have heard of. This came out from CUA Press 1 or 2 years ago by a Jesuit, a good Jesuit, as far as I can tell, Father Chris Hadley, and this book is called "A Symphony of Distances: Patristic, Modern, and Gendered Dimensions of Balthasar's Trinitarian Theology." It's one of the best texts that really treats his theology of the Trinity holistically, which is a difficult thing to do. And he asks all the right questions about Balthasar's kenoticism. He has some objections that I don't stand with him on objecting in those terms, but as a secondary resource, I can't recommend it enough.
Very
Let me
good.
begin with just a quote from Balthasar on what he means by kenosis, and I think this characterizes it really well. And by the way, a first clarification. So we've defined kenosis here. A lot of people get scared because when you talk about Balthasar's theology of the Trinity, you start saying things like supra-temporal, or in this case, kenosis, a kenosis that grounds all being. And so immediately there's a fear that comes up because we're saying that there's something that belongs only to the Father, an original self-emptying. So then exactly that's where that fear comes in of like, does the Father have an original wound? And so everything sort of pours forth from him as this wounded, right? So what's going on there? What does he mean by kenosis? That's one of the things I'll try to address. So he says, in giving himself, the Father does not give something or even everything that he has, but all that he is. For in God there is only being, not having. So the Father's being passes over without remainder to the begotten Son. And it would be a mistake to suggest that he, the Father, becomes or develops as a result of this self-giving. This total self-giving, to which the Son and the Spirit respond by an equal self-giving, is a kind of, and even here he uses quotes, a kind of death, a first radical kenosis, as one might say. So just to flag that he's using the language figuratively there.
Yeah.
It is a kind of, quote, super death, Ubertod, that is a component of all love. And so super death used there as a description of what we mean by love, and that forms the basis in creation for all instances of the good death, from self-forgetfulness in favor of the beloved, right up to that highest love by which a man, quote, gives his life for his friends. So what Balthasar, there's lots to say, obviously. One thing to say at the outset, I think, is that Balthasar is doing a lot here, but one of the things he's trying to do is to ground the sort of apex experience and expression of friendship or of love for another. And he's willing to use this language of death, of self-emptying, of radical gift. So a sort of martyrological vision of love's perfect expression in the temporal realm. And so that's where the language of death first comes in, not as a symptom of sin simply, but as a way of talking about what's perfect even in human love. This total self-dispossession for the sake of the other that's expressed in precisely the language from Christ, right? No one lays down my life for me. I lay it down of my own accord. A man gives his life for his friends, right? This gift of life. If we call that death, then yeah, I do want to ground that in the Trinity. I want to say that because God is love, and we see this perfect expression of love in the here and now, then it better have a ground, right? Now, that ground is not something that the Trinity, as it were, does. These aren't, as it were, discrete actions, temporally or chronologically ordered. Although Balthasar preserves the Trinitarian hierarchy, the Trinitarian taxis, because it's the Father's gift first, in some sense. But what the persons of the Trinity are in their mutual belonging is a total self-gift one to the other. So it's not simply about the Father dies first and shows the Son how to die. It's rather what we mean by communion, by mutual indwelling, by perichoresis is something like what we talk about when we see a perfect death for the sake of another. This total, all that I am, not just all that I will do or everything I'm going to do, but what I am is yours. Total self-disposition. Now, in the Trinity, of course, you need to remove and properly relate via analogy all of those temporal and spatial categories. So this is not an action that takes place in time. The Father doesn't do it, and then the Son does it, and then the Spirit comes as a result of that. But this is atemporal or supertemporal. This is what they are, right? And in fact, it's so much what they are that it characterizes the personal names that we are given to ascribe to the persons. The Father is Father because he's the Father of the Son. And there we can be firmly grounded in Augustine, in the Cappadocian. Balthasar's, as it were, adapting this more sophiological language, this kenotic language explicitly, in order to read it, I think, with and in the tradition of the Cappadocians in particular, of yeah, the
Yeah.
procession as mutual
So yeah,
belonging.
the Father is the Father of the Son from all eternity. And the Spirit is the bond of unity of those two as an act of self-dispossession from all eternity, that this is what they are from all eternity. Uh, but anyway, so yes, so in other words, we can be interrelational. We can give the gift of self. We can die to self and all those sort of things, but we are bounded by finitude and we are hampered by sin. There is no finitude within God and there is no sin within God. And so when the Father from all eternity self-dispossesses and gives all that he is to the Son,
Yeah.
there is no remainder. I mean, it's an infinite gift, so complete that it comprises a single divine essence.
Right. That's right. One of the
Because I just want to dispel any listener
yeah,
out
oh
there
yeah.
thinking that we're talking in tritheistic language and this kind of stuff, which is an accusation that's often leveled at Balthasar that he flirts with tritheistic categories and so on, but that's just not true. But anyway, go ahead.
One small point I think that's worth making is that so I describe this in terms of a positive notion of death as self-gift, but it is also the case for Balthasar that this or kenosis, this original death of love, super death, even as he calls it, again, all in quotes, and he's using that explicitly there too. So it's figurative language to describe a mystery. Um, it is also the origin for our way of thinking through the death that comes as the wages of sin. But the death that comes as the wages of sin is a parasite upon that positive notion of death. It's a cessation of self that's not a gift to another. So it's precisely a pouring out into nothingness. And
Yeah.
so a commitment to no thing at all. And so as it were, there's two, I mean, he talks about many meanings of death elsewhere in the trilogy, but I think that's maybe one way to think about the relation between this super death, which is a positive expression of perfect love, and the death that we typically speak of as the wages of sin.
Yes, and what this does too, which is often ignored, is it creates the condition of possibility on a theological level
Mhm.
for many attributes of our existence which would otherwise remain completely mysterious to us, in the sense that, well, why are we temporal beings? What is temporality? Why are we interrelational beings? What is interrelationality? uh Especially why are we material beings, for whom all of our experiences are in some sense mediated to us through this filter of materiality? This is why Balthasar talks about supra temporality, and in God and so forth. It's not that he wants to reduce God to the finite concepts of the temporal, but to, in a sense, show that these aspects of our humanity are positive perfections of creation and have an analog, therefore, within God.
Yeah. And that if read aright, if experienced beautifully, if you put on the mind of Christ, which precedes that the beginning of that hymn to Christ in Philippians, then you're able to see those human experiences as disclosive of a mystery which is deeper and greater and more transcendent in the Trinity. Now, another element of all of this, which is key for Balthasar and how this breaks out into his wider Trinitarian theology, is that so everything I said, I think, helps to give a better picture of the Trinity as this great community, this communion, this mutual belonging. And so you can start to, if you're picture thinking too much, you can start to think of this great sort of blob or glob of the Trinity as sort of happy togetherness. But it's this language of total self-gift, which also creates those infinite distances between the persons, the theological persons of the Trinity.
Right.
The Father is not the Son is not the Father, the Son is not the Spirit is not a Son. And so it's precisely this language of total self-gift, which is the foundation of personal identity, of boundary, of limit. And so then you can start to reintroduce this language of dialogue, of for Balthasar, of obedience, of command, of responsiveness. And so this self-gift both secures the unity, but as it secures the unity, it makes the unity possible because it's a unity of three alone, which is open to creation and the world and human freedom and so forth. But this is how Balthasar can spiral from this discussion of kenosis to the temporal mission of the Son, for example, as the temporal unfolding of an eternal mystery of the Son's
Yeah.
responsive yes to the Father. And
Yes.
that's the language of obedience comes in.
In his very poetic book, Heart of the World, the very first book of his, by the way, that Ignatius Press translated into English, uh, Erasmo Maricakis, whatever his last name is, Father Simeon. Now he's in monastery in Massachusetts. Translated it, Erasmo. Anyway, in that book, Balthasar says that love can only happen at a distance.
Yeah,
Uh, and so one of the points to us being material beings, that in a sense everything is mediated through our materiality, is precisely that it creates, as you said, those boundaries between me and you and so on. And those boundaries are the very source of our unity. That only by being bounded, which I then overcome in a sense, in love, in kenosis, in the self-dispossession, that a true union of souls can take place. And were there no such boundaries, if love was not at a distance, then we wouldn't really even have love.
that's right. That's right. Yeah, and there's so much. I mean, just one minor reflection. I in almost every class I teach, I try to begin as early as possible with a reading of the creation narratives in Genesis, and I do this sort of rhapsodic recitation, which I'm stealing from Ratzinger's homilies on Genesis, where if you listen aright and then read it a certain way, you can see this structure of God said, and then there was, and he saw that it was good. And if you read
Yeah.
it with Ratzinger, for example, what you see is that in the creation narratives, you have the emergence of something which is not God and yet which is good. And that I've started to call that a sort of a proto gospel. That difference from God is not something to be overcome, but it's the source of your freedom and intelligibility and all of that goodness.
It's also where we are most like God. Balthasar in Heart of the World also says we are like God precisely in the fact that we are not God. A very
Right.
paradoxical statement, but go ahead.
Um, you mentioned Margaret Turek earlier, and I'll never stop recommending her book Atonement. But
Oh God, it's so
the
good.
images she plays with in that book is the positive distance of love, and then the distance wrought by sin wrought distance, as she puts it there. And one of the things we see play out in the Paschal Mystery through our Lord's incarnation up to his death and resurrection is um, this condescension or self-emptying of the Son into our state of sin-wrought distance, precisely to enter into that and transform it into the distance proper to love. And so an expression of filial obedience, but always a transformation, a defeat of sin by transforming it into the proper distance of love and of obedience. And it's the same connection for Balthasar, that this originally positive distance between the Father and the Son is the place that our sin is taken up in that relation between them and thus transformed. And that's why it's especially significant that this organic language of us becoming sons in the Son, members of one body, it's literal in that sense. We are literally taken up into that same relation of that same flesh and so on.
Oh,
You can
absolutely.
spin and spin off into all the connections from this
So
point.
yeah, so that plumbs the depths of Christ's descent, his
Yeah,
kenosis, insofar as he descends into hell, which of course, once again, many Thomists object to saying that Balthasar, the Balthasar saying that Christ descends into the hell of the damned, and not simply into the sort of Sheol of the fathers, righteous fathers, the harrowing of hell, where Jesus busts down the gates of Sheol and smacks Satan around and drags up the righteous few that are down there. Yeah, he kicks Satan a new one, and then you get some of these old icons that show, Jesus kind of,
agree. But yes,
yeah, kicking in the door and
yeah,
beating Satan to a pulp and dragging these people out of Sheol and so forth. But so this is, but Ratzinger and others have voiced strong support for the Balthasarian view that Christ does descend into the hell of the damned, and that is precisely to transform from within that their sin wrought ultimate distance from God. This is an important point. I mean, hell is a Christological category. Heaven and hell are both Christological categories. They both exist within the Sacred Heart of Christ. In some sense, hell is therefore Christ's hell, and therefore there is a condition of possibility for even hell in the sense that hell represents this distance from God, and but it is now a distance that Christ has transcended and transformed. Am I
yeah.
getting that right? I don't know.
You are, yeah, and I can show receipts on this. I think, and in fact, a little blurb, probably a year, 18 months from now, but I will have a book coming out that takes up this conversation between Balthasar and the Thomists on this point on kenosis and hell and so forth. It'll be an update, a revision of my dissertation with
Who's publishing this?
Whitfenstock,
Oh yeah, okay,
the
got it.
one where you basically pay them to publish it, but they accepted it, and I'm excited nonetheless. But that's the way to get it out there. So yeah, this is a conversation near and dear to my own work, which gets tremendously complex. Let me gesture at Balthazar's response to all of that, which is for him, especially when we're going to talk about hell, the mystery of self-emptying, all of that, eschatological, census, fate. Um, I think, and this is me extremely paraphrasing and distilling him, he really thinks that most of our tradition has uh, made up our imagery for how we think about hell. And
Yeah.
the Augustinian Thomistic synthesis has generated um, a sense of the mystery of hell where when you picture it, it's already occupied. For Balthasar, you said it, Larry, so I'm just going to unpack it. For Balthasar, what we know about hell, truly, we know from Christ, from his experience of um, from his experience of having taken on the total effects of sin in a way that you or I could not. He can take on the total negative sin wrought distance as a son, which is not something available to you or I. And that's what grounds this sense of Christ's acrobatic love from the height to the absolute depths. When we talk about hell, it needs to begin from that place of what we know about it is that Christ suffered its effects for me. Now, from there, you may be able to build up into the great imagery of Dante's Inferno in particular. But even there, Balthasar gets very critical of it's not clear that the Inferno in particular is a place that Christ has a presence. For Balthasar, I think actually um, the most fruitful image for what hell might mean are Christ's wounds, this open place in his body which remains there, which shows that something decisive has wounded his flesh, but has been overcome, and that that's not erased or covered over in the resurrection, but remains there. Um, but nevertheless, there's a hope that there's nothing in there. And anyway, that's another spin out conversation. Um, but
Yeah.
that's an indication, I think, of the direction Balthasar wants to go in those conversations that are our imagination and our theologizing about heaven and hell both, because heaven becomes a possibility only when Christ dies and is resurrected, just as hell, just as purgatory, right? We don't have eschatology proper as ultimate eschatological fates until the Paschal mystery. That is decisive. It's the end and the beginning of history and supernatural history, and as such, heaven, hell, and purgatory are opened then only. And if our thinking about hell is not sufficiently Christological, then we're not really thinking about hell. Then we're overly picture thinking, and we get into lots of oddities in our tradition. Balthasar is very convicted that the Augustinian Thomistic synthesis has left out so much of Eastern theology on reflection of deaths having been overcome and so on and so forth, which has a whole different set of rich imagery. So uniting those two is also a concern of his.
And theosis.
And theosis, yeah. What it is to become like God is to precisely have this capacity to recognize in my own suffering that Christ has suffered something worse in my stead, which I deserved, and that is disclosive of what it means to become like Christ, to be able to suffer my fate in Him, with Him, to be willing to see someone suffering the effects of damnation, namely Christ on the cross, and to say, Lord, let me carry that with you, or Lord, you get down, I'll
Yeah.
do that.
Yeah.
That's really the image of Christian love suffering.
I think this issue of the fact that heaven and hell only open up to us after Christ's coming, and they are indeed Christological categories and not places separate from Christ. And if you follow Christ, you get to go to Disney World in the sky. And if you don't follow Christ, you get to go to Disney World down below, since I think Disney World is the Antichrist. But anyway,
Right.
you get the point. So that, and by contrast, and you might know something more than I would, the concepts that Christians just take for granted post Christ, heaven and hell, it's not altogether clear, based on what I know anyway, that the intertestamental Second Temple Judaism, that was the environment into which Christ came, that they had very clear-cut notions of heaven and hell. I mean, certainly early Judaism had very, very vague concepts of an afterlife,
Yeah.
very vague. I mean, and there were whole Jewish sects like the Sadducees who denied the
Yeah.
resurrection of the dead and so on. Uh, and but they that all these very but there certainly were strands, Hellenized strands within Judaism about souls migrating to heaven. There were
Mhm.
strands within Judaism that were very Hellenized as well, in the sense that the only people that merit paradise are those who establish some sort of heroic martyrdom for this, like the Maccabees or whatever, they get resurrected, whereas the rest of us have to go to Sheol or whatever. So, but though all of these, and N.T. Wright's good on this kind of stuff too, all of these ideas within Judaism that are just sort of hanging loosely together coalesce, coalesce in Christianity, and it's because of Christ.
That's right. I think I think the chronological period into which Christ entered, this notion of Sheol appears to have been the most regnant. And Sheol is nothing, if, well, as you once called it in class, and I'm quoting you here, that dark, skanky place, um, which almost
Yeah.
made it my dissertation, but didn't pass editorial
Yeah,
muster.
I guess the viewers should know. Yeah, Dan was a former student of mine at
Yeah,
De
that's
Sales University. Yeah, yeah, that dank, skanky place.
Sheol is at the very least this zone of non-communication. That what the consequences of death meant that when you're gone, and there's no capacity for intercession, for belonging. It's precisely where communion stops. And so the significance of Christ taking an unbreakable bond of obedience between him and the Father into that place is precisely what transforms Sheol from this zone of non-communication to, yeah, the transformation of death into love, right? Death, where is thy sting? That's precisely what was taken out of it.
And I don't mean to interrupt, but also transforms Sheol into hell,
Yes,
in the sense that now the choice is clear. So whereas there's no communication, there is now intercommunication, and that can lead to transformation into the death of love, heaven, but it would also lead to the transformation and solidification of choosing no.
right,
And
right.
and
It makes
Balthasar does maintain that that no is possible.
For sure. And he's not a post-mortem conversion type. He doesn't subscribe to that. I can give you the text for that. No, the sin against the Holy Spirit and the denial of Christ's death for you is precisely what's possible now. So it's not that Balthasar's theology of the descent into hell sort of evacuates the possibility that I might be damned. It actually makes it possible. It makes it extremely dire. Everything's at stake all the time. Now there's a face that you have to reject or not. And all of my actions here and now, besides heading into the confessional occasionally, point in the direction of I seem to be pretty capable of denying what's on offer to me. And if I don't break that habit, then I'm at risk of loss. And of
Yeah.
course, God calls us in many and diverse ways. But for Balthazar, I mean, it's precisely an amping up of the drama that or a ramping up of the drama that happens there. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, it would be I'd be remiss if I didn't point out that Christ's descent into hell is what makes hell possible.
Yeah. Yeah.
In a crazy kind of way. Had he never descended into hell, then maybe most of us would just be in that danky, skanky, dark place. And some Thomists like Jacques Maritain entertain the idea that most of the non-baptized are simply granted a kind of natural, endless happiness post-mortem. So maybe we could postulate a kind of semi-unhappy skankiness in the next life had Christ not come, and actually creates hell.
Yeah. Yeah. Let me let me take us back because I haven't answered one of your original questions, which is to talk about um, the sort of Russian element of this.
I was
Balthazar,
just getting to that. Let's get to the Russians now. Why are they wrong?
so and this I'm just grabbing from Jenny Martin's book. So any insight here is originally hers, and she's really the guide on this. So the particular source for the presence of this theology textually in what we're talking about from Balthazar is Sergei or Sergios Bulgakov. In particular, his work, The Lamb of God. In Lamb of God, Bulgakov writes that the incarnation is the quote metaphysical Golgotha of the self-crucifixion of the Logos in time. The historical Golgotha was only a consequence of the metaphysical one. Very strong language from him.
Yeah,
Balthazar, when taking up that language, at the same time has walls of text meant to guard against some of the obvious things that we would want to guard against there to remain within the bounds of orthodoxy. Here's what he starts to say. It's therefore preferable to be guided by some of Bulgakov's fundamental ideas while avoiding his excesses. And to take, so what are we going to take from him? To take the selflessness of the divine persons as of pure relations in love within the Godhead as the basis of everything. So what we take from Bulgakov is this personal language of gift, precisely in this phrase of selflessness. So selflessness as the basis of everything. This selflessness is the basis of a first form of kenosis that lies in creation, especially in the creation of man who is free. For the creator here gives up a part of his freedom to the creature in the act of creating. Right? God sees that everything is good and sees that everything is very good when the gendered pair of man and woman is at the top. But this he can dare to do only in virtue of his foreseeing and taking into account the second and truest kenosis, that of the cross. And what is the cross in Balthasar's theology? It's where he makes good, the Father makes good the uttermost consequences of creation's freedom and goes beyond them. So for Balthasar, the cross is precisely the experience that God can be wounded by our sin to the point of death in the flesh, shows that he really gave us our freedom, whatever the consequences. And those consequences are pretty dire, the death of God in the flesh, right? In this, kenosis, as the surrender of the form of God, becomes the decisive act of the love of the Son, who translates his being begotten by the Father into the expressive form of creaturely obedience. So if you want to return to those original categories we had set up, where the Son is the perfect, grateful reception of himself from the Father and the self-offering of that back. When you take that eternal, fruitful, perichoretic reality and spread it out in time in the form of a life that's poured out for your friends, it looks like the cross in response to sin. So that's what that language of this kenotic base, which is expressed as obedience, right? What the Son is in the Trinity is expressed in a beautiful way in the incarnation. In fact, when Margaret Turek writes about this, the origin of her book on atonement, she's reflecting on the language from, I think it's First John. In this way, the love of God was revealed to us. Like, this is how in history we come to know who the Trinity is. It's in this way, through this action, Christ on the cross.
Right, right.
So this is the expressive form of creaturely obedience, but the whole Trinity remains involved in this act. The Father by sending out the Son, the Spirit by uniting them in their separation. So it's all a Trinitarian act as well. Very densely packed. I mean, these things are crazy tied together in Balthasar. And as I was interrupting myself, you can see all the connections, which makes him difficult to read, but I think he's at the very least consistent. If you
Yeah.
don't, however, agree with using this language of kenosis, of selflessness, of person-to-person gift, which founds the existence of the other, then yeah, it's going to be difficult to have that
Yeah,
conversation.
there's an emphasis in some of the Russian sociologists to say that that in order for God to create anything at all ad extra and certainly to descend into it, there has to be some kind of contraction within God in order to make space for that which is not God, a contraction. And Balthasar criticizes that idea, if I remember correctly, and saying, no, quite the opposite.
Right.
Quite the opposite. It's in the infinite expansiveness of those Trinitarian relations that creation is precisely, in a sense, quote unquote, located.
Yeah. It makes you more yourself to let another be, actually. That's like the great paradox of
Right,
human
right.
relationality of love, right? The more so I think about it in terms of my toddler, the more I really let her do my thing, the more it actually makes me a father in those moments because I'm widening the space of her world such that she can be more herself, which also makes me someone who can widen the world for another. Like that's the unique way a father sort of
Yeah,
gives.
yeah, exactly. Which means too that your love for your child and so forth is not a form of you contracting your own self-interest in order to make room for her.
No,
In order,
although I suck, it feels that way.
it feels that way psychologically for us because of sin and all those sorts of things.
Right.
But in reality, as you well know, in loving your child, you're actually expanding your yourself. And furthermore, there is in some of this sociological tradition this notion that there's still this latent kind of competitive concept
Yeah.
between God's eternity and our temporality, because they'll talk about, well, if God's going to create odd extra and so on and so forth, this is God self-limiting. God imposes upon himself a
Mhm.
self-limitation from all eternity and so forth. And this, once again, it just betrays a competitive mentality when in fact it's the opposite.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, one of the ways that gets really tricky and where Thomists differ from Balthasar. So the Thomistic way of speaking about Christ's three modes of knowledge, uh, namely the knowledge of all things through creation, the possibility of knowledge through experience, and what's the other knowledge of first principles, something like that.
Yeah, it's the knowledge of first principles.
Yeah. So you get this sense of if you're going to talk about kenosis in the Thomistic system, maybe you can say that one of those forms of knowledge is sort of left behind in the incarnation. But when you look at Thomas on those questions, it gets really wonky because he says that Christ really does possess this experiential way of coming to know things, which is proper to creatures, but he possesses it on top of those other forms of knowledge, which raises the question of if he has not active knowledge of all created things and knowledge of first principles, what can it possibly mean to say that he additionally learns things through experience? And someone like a Balthasar is going to say to that tradition, you're actually emptying of meaning this phrase of he comes to learn at all. And so you're making him inhuman just so far as you do that. But that's an example of if you're going to begin with simply Thomistic categories and then try to read Balthasar, of course you're going to talk past each other because he's beginning from a different place
Yeah,
with the incarnation.
in Betts's chapter on humility of God, he goes on to say, look, if we are going to drive a wedge between the economy of salvation and who God is ad intra on the topic of the divine humility, divine kenosis, what's to stop us from doing that same thing with regard to the love that Christ shows for us? You know, that maybe that's not also expressive of who God is ad intra. Maybe God doesn't love us ad intra the way that he does in the economy. So we could extend that bifurcation to a whole range of things that most Thomists would not want to extend that to.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. You know who else is great in responding to Thomas? Angela Franks has had a really awesome
Woohoo!
dialogue
I've had
on.
her on the show too. I need to get Angela back on now that she's a highfalutin professor at Catholic University.
Yeah, she's the best. She doesn't talk about Balthazar as much. She's so good on all the other stuff, but she's like my champion in these conversations with Thomas. Her textual response to Thomas Joseph White in particular is probably the most powerful, pushing those places where
Where does
his
she do that? Where does she do that?
there was a symposium in Nova et Vetera on TJ White's book on the Trinity, and she has particular, it's like a 30-page response, a very textual line by line thing. Or maybe it was on his Christology, whatever. There's a symposium in Nova et Vetera on one of
Okay.
his heavy tomes that she has a lengthy response. It's very helpful. She calls it a
And
Thomistic Balthasarian response. So
she certainly has the theological chops
yeah,
to pull that off. She is I mean, it's the ascendancy of brilliant female theologians, Balthasarian types. I mean, from Jenny Martin to Angela Franks to Caitlin Gilson, and I mean, Margaret Turek.
oh yeah,
I mean, they're to say that women don't have a voice in the church. It's kind of these are some of the most powerful. Tracy Rowland. I mean, come on, some of the
yeah,
best theology being done out there right now in the Catholic Guild
yeah.
is being done by female theologians, and I tip them my hat to all of them. They're brilliant.
I think
And
it's
I say
worth.
that, and I don't say that in a patronizing, patriarchal,
Oh yeah,
condescending. Oh, look at the ladies doing theology. I don't mean it to be taken that way at all.
they're
I
my
mean
teacher.
that most sincerely.
Yeah,
It's about time, is my point. It's about time that we saw in the church these powerful female theologians. And I would throw my wife in there as well. You know, it's amazing.
yeah. I like how Jennifer Newsom Martin accounts for what this language adds to things because you can get into conversations with Thomists who might say like, "Look, I'm not going to follow you there, but actually I take your point. I just don't think that you need to talk like Balthazar does to make those points." So I want to read a little bit from what Jenny says about what this adds to things. She asks, how does the suggestion of an original kenosis in the Trinity provide an adequate solution to the question of the relation between the economic and the immanent Trinity? She says, this mode of perfect, absolute, self-sacrificial, and ecstatic love, which is constitutive for divine personhood, is that which substantially and essentially is divinity. So this is a way of talking about what we mean by God.
Yeah.
To sound the Johannine theme, God is love. For Bulgakov and Balthasar, kenosis takes place at the level of form, not eternal essence. And there's a difference between Schelling and Hegel and others. Because both Bulgakov and Balthasar hold that this eternal self-donation, there's the gift language, is essential to the life of the Trinity, because of that, it becomes a defensible premise that the incarnation and death of Christ on the cross do not represent a change in God from earth to heaven, time to eternity, but is rather a continuation of the substantial modality of self-giving love at the core of divine being, which is ordered toward human salvation. Now, entailed of all of this, as Nick Healy and Margaret McCarthy would add, you're going to need to reread what you mean by predestination. Things are predestined in Christ and not primarily for heaven contra hell, with some gifts withheld from all eternity for those who will go to hell. But
Yeah.
predestination, the fate of creation in the Son, simply. You start from there. Otherwise, you're going to end up with all sorts of weird distinctions.
And Nick Healy, if you're listening to this, please answer an email once in a while, would you? Nick's a great fan. I'm going to see him in New Hampshire this summer. He's holding a. Are you going to be there? He's got like some
I'll
kind
be
of.
there. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Carrie and I are going to be at Arkwood Farms or whatever it's called.
Fantastic.
I love Nick. Nick is so brilliant. So is Margaret. So
And Dr. Balthasar. Yeah.
I look forward to that. But I've been trying to get Nick on the show, and so I email him, and it's like it goes into a black hole. I told that to David Seash.
It's faster to train a pigeon. I learned. Yeah.
I mentioned this to David C. Schindler, and he just laughed and laughed and laughed. Yeah, that's Nick. But anyway, I love Nick. It's great. So that's a great quote from Jenny Martin, and it really gets to the nub of things. Uh, it- Once again, in a way that only she can do.
I mean, I do think, frankly, in a way, there is a sort of a wedge between the Thomistic and Balthasarian camps on this, because it simply is, as it stands now in the current scholarly discourse, I should say. I have hope for future collaboration, but as it stands now, it really is a different language. It's almost a different set of foundational premises, which allows you to speak this way, and that explains some of the perpetual impasses and so forth. I want to flag there's a work coming out from CUA Press this summer from a friend of mine, Michael Higgins. It's called Giving One's Word, and it's a rereading of Aquinas's social analogy for the Trinity that precisely sees all of these fertile grounds in Aquinas for thinking through what it means that the word is given, that can allow for a more, he's not doing it as an apology for Balthasar, but as really you might say a creative retrieval of Aquinas in this language. So I think there's plenty of room for even the
Well,
Thomistic tradition to
I'm
move.
glad. I'll definitely take a look at that book because it goes back to what I said earlier. We have to be very careful not to pigeonhole Thomism as
Right.
simply
Right.
one form. I mean, Tracy Rowland in her book called Catholic Theology, now it's like a 5-year-old book, but she identified 17 different forms, schools of
Yeah.
Thomistic theology in the 20th century. And so and there is such a thing as ressourcement Thomism. Thomas Joseph White is a bit of a ressourcement Thomist because he takes Balthasar and the ressourcement theologians seriously as interlocutors and not just as foils against which to kick. But then you have Thomas, Joseph Pieper, Norris Clark, guys like this who are very open to ressourcement ideas. So the point
Yeah.
that I'm trying to make here is to agree with you that a rereading of Aquinas through the lens of some of these theological achievements of today,
Yeah.
I think would be an extremely fruitful enterprise, and is a fruitful enterprise, and many are engaging in it, I think.
Yeah. What I like about Thomas Joseph White, many things. I mean, I'm very my dissertation, half of it was a response to what I think is a misreading of Balthasar. But his reasons for reading Balthasar are because he, I think, rightly recognizes that there are questions that Thomas did not ask, and which only after they've been asked and explored by someone in this modern context in dialogue with
Yeah.
Heidegger and well, can you return to Aquinas with that language and see if there's grounds in there. And that's where we can differ on. Well, actually, I think there are places in Aquinas where you're not interpreting this sufficiently capaciously or something. But that initial step of, hey, there really are questions that were not asked by Aquinas because he did not foresee them, and which others have answered very well. I don't like the consequences of their answers, so let's see if there's more of a ground in Thomas for that. That's why he does such. And you're right, T.J. White has read like everything in Balthasar, and he really is
He's
a
also a great, great guy. He's just a great guy. A good musician too, you know?
well, in fact, I mean, it was funny when I was writing my dissertation. I'm keeping in mind that, it's Thomas Joseph White that I'm writing against, but also to get my toddler to sleep at night for many of those years, we would listen to the Hillbilly Thomas. So I would write against him during the day and he would sing to my daughter at night.
Yeah, yeah. No,
Yeah.
the Dominicans, those Dominicans they're doing great things. And
They
I
are.
have high hopes for the Angelicum now under his leadership. He's over there in Rome at the Angelicum.
Yeah.
Let's we're into this about an hour. I didn't run this past you first, but I'm going to maybe throw this at you now. So
Okay.
feel free to decline to answer. But I would say, okay, this is all very high end, high caliber.
Yeah.
Uh, this is top shelf bourbon theology we're doing, a top shelf Scotch theology we're doing here in terms of the idea. Not that I'm a top shelf theologian, but you are, but I'm not. And you get the point. It's these are the ideas that we're dealing with. How
Yeah.
does that translate into ecclesiology? And the reason why I'm asking this is
Yeah.
to go back to John Betts. He had an article in the New Ressourcement Journal. It's sitting around here somewhere. Hang on a second. Um, just bear. I ask that you please bear with me. Here it is. John Betts. This is in the fall 2024, volume one, number three issue of the New Ressourcement Journal. Right here. I'll hold it up properly for those who can see. There it is, the New Resource. This is the journal put out by Word on Fire. It's a wonderful journal, and I say that and I'm on the editorial board of Communio, so I hope there's no competition between these two things. Uh, and I don't think there is, but nevertheless, because they're doing different things. Anyway, John Betts, the analogy of tradition toward a more radical ressourcement. And that article is so, I don't know if you've read it, Dan. It's
Yeah.
very
Yeah.
programmatic. It's one of the most brilliant expositions, I think, of ressourcement theology for today and its ecclesiological significance. And significantly, with regard to our conversation here, the category of a kenotic ecclesiology, essentially, is what he's saying that ressourcement theology has to be about these days. And then he points to the church, boy, he's got a couple of just on fire paragraphs I'm going to be using in my next blog post on the hermeneutic of kenosis. Just some fiery paragraphs where he just, to be vulgar here, he rips the church a new one. He just rips it for not living kenotically, and that the form and structure of the church, not in its apostolic constitution, he's an Orthodox Catholic, but just the way it is played out in time and history is just so non-kenotic.
Yeah.
And anyway, maybe you have some comments on this.
I do. I mean, almost entirely autobiographical or rhapsodic. I mean, well, first of all, I was your student and I was there when you hung it all up to move to the farm and embark upon this charitable work.
You were there
Uh,
for my last lecture.
that's right. Packed room. Um,
It was a shit lecture, by the way. I hadn't prepared a thing, and I just
Notice I
rambled on.
didn't
And
comment on the lecture. Yeah.
yeah,
No, I am a theologian who I left a tenure track position. And I wanted to, I've always wanted to, I clearly have administrative skills. And I think when you can identify without question your skills, then they need to be put at the service of the church. I don't think that means everyone needs to work at a chancery like I've done, but that whatever your skills are, put them at the service of Christ's people. I do think though, here's where I like Betts's article a lot. I think far too many people who like theology and who like thinking theologically think that that means that they need to um, go into teaching. And I encounter such a need, such a deep need for folks who know doctrine in and out, who have an active working prudence, who can see how doctrine is meant to shape pastoral practice. Because let me just say, and this is not a comment on particular people here in the Archdiocese of Philadelphia, but we need more people who can know what the church says, having taken on that mind of Christ in a formal way, perhaps through their academic training, and who are willing to create, to take initiative, to organize, to administer programs and things so on. So I think on the one hand, like explicitly, more theologians need to serve their local church. The church does not exist globally in that sense. And the media cycle where we're waiting on every word of the Holy Father whom we're praying for, um,
Yeah.
you need to serve your local church, which means the local bishop, which means that chancery, which means these parishes, that deanery, those people in your neighborhood. And I think for more theologians than are currently doing it, that means try to be a director of the pro-life office or the evangelization office, or assist in some way in that form, because these things need capable shepherds. There are a lot of very willing, very on fire people who don't have the formation that you've put yourself through. So one of the things that I take from Betts's article, um, theologians and this phenomenon of lay theology was growing in this direction of we're all going to have tenure track academic positions. And I really think the state of the church today and of pastoral ministry means that we need more of us. And again, I'm having this conversation. I read, I write. Serving the church full time has not taken away that capacity from me. But theology at the service of the local church needs to happen. And I'm growing increasingly impatient with the discussion boards and the conferences I go to where academics are just talking past each other about things that they wrote. Like I'm getting to the point of like, will you just shut up and help people close to where you live?
Bingo.
So I'm kind of there. Maybe I've been red pilled or
No,
something.
this is Betts
That's
is kind of,
intrinsic to the task of theology to be at the service of pastoral practice.
I mean, and it's very Balthasarian in that programmatic essay, on spirituality and theology. What's it? Theology and sanctity. Yeah.
Yeah.
Where he goes through the history of the divorce between academic theology and spirituality,
Yeah.
which has been tragic in the history of the church. But I agree with you. I have gotten to the point now where I just, with rare exceptions, the the conference at Notre Dame last fall being one of them. It
Right.
was just a fantastic conference. I absolutely loathe and despise going to academic conferences. And for that very reason, to me, that even if the theology there is profound and
Yes.
moving, and boy, these are some smart people. There
Right.
there is hanging over all of it an air of irrelevance. Not in
And
the theology as
Balthasar,
such. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, as you know, he could have had an academic career four times over, and he devoted his life to giving the exercises to students and to lay people and to working with Adrienne.
Yeah,
And that to me is instructive.
and
Ratzinger got taken away from his office, his theologian's office, and look at what a gift that was to put him
thank
in a
God. Yeah, thank God he didn't take an academic post somewhere. I would also add this, and this is rather pejorative, but I'm going to say it. Most Catholic universities and colleges in North America and Western Europe have made themselves completely irrelevant to this project of a more kenotic church, because they're all terrified of going out of business, and they're all bloated and overpriced consumer driven enterprises, and so they've bought into the lie that Catholic identity is a bad market choice. And so we have to make sure that even if we have a so-called Orthodox theology department, it's got to be encapsulated and sequestered at the university. And the rest of the university can go kukutsa nuts and be as crazy as we want to be, because that's going to be the high-end market value that we're pursuing. And the theologians have to swim in those waters. And it becomes almost impossible, therefore, to break out of the constrictions that such a model imposes in order to reach a broader audience. I feel like it's crazy. You know, every, people say, 10, I'm now 12 years away out of university teaching, like Rachel Coleman, who says, "Hey, Chapp, you finally figured out what you want to be when you grow up, and you waited until you were like 54 years old to do that. In the sense that I'm now reaching through things like this more people than I did in the classroom. And that's not to I don't regret spending 20 years in the classroom, 24 if you include my high school teaching. I don't regret that at all. Not one bit. I loved it. I loved every minute of it. And there's a time and place for everything. Uh, but what I'm saying is what I've discovered is to concur with what you're saying. In leaving the university, I left to start this farm with only a vague idea of what lay ahead. And what God has done is to, in a sense, break me open, just smash me open and say, okay, everything you did before had value, but now this is going to be something, in a sense, that's going to reach a broader audience. And I'm not tuning my own here at all, my own horn here at all. I'm terrible at this, actually. This is the most Luddite podcast in the history of all podcasts. Most low tech bullshit ever. I can't edit. I can't do anything. You know, it's insane. But anyway, you get the point that I'm
Yeah,
trying to
yeah,
make here. And you said something earlier where you said the people like what you're doing, and so you need to create something.
yeah.
The Holy Spirit right now is creating new things within the. And I'm not saying God's doing a new thing, all that nonsense. But people often say, well, what's the future of the church? And so, well, we don't know. We don't know because right now the Holy Spirit is about the business of deconstructing something and reconstructing it in creative ways. And this is where the lay revolution has got to really kick in.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, just to deepen one of the examples I was giving. So we've launched Archbishop Nelson Perez here in Philadelphia published a pastoral letter in early January on the feast of St. John Newman, fourth Bishop of Philadelphia, launching a pastoral initiative of renewal. And the major language here is that we need something new. It's about re-envisioning what a parish is. We're going to be planting 10 missionary hubs in the next year and 50 to, I could go on and on about the plan. But you better believe that in those listening sessions and the planning and the logistical stuff, if there's not someone in that room who can say, stop coming up with new tasks for the pastor. What are the pastor's two duties? The salvation of souls and the catechesis necessary to do that in his local area. That's it. If you start gesticulating about pastors need to be equipped, no. In order to figure out what new thing we need and the way in which the Spirit is going to give life and bear fruit to our works in this area, you better have an understanding of what's old, of what's traditional. And I'm finding that in those conversations, all too often, there's only one of me. And so it's this thick task of like, okay, sorry to interrupt, but the canon law says this, and really a parish is this local territory. You need to be very
Yeah.
clear on what we
Yeah.
mean if we're build something that's needed everywhere. That's needed absolutely everywhere. And maybe a formal academic background, while it bore fruit in the time that you taught, it can help in ways that literally no one has imagined in a chancery setting and so on.
And
Uh,
this is so true, so true. I interviewed Mike Baxter
yeah, that was
last
great.
week. Great guy, former Holy Cross priest that started a Catholic worker house in South Bend, and I mean, just all around brilliant guy. But Baxter said something very interesting where he's quoting another Catholic worker, Frank Cordaro, saying to people who say, well, what do you expect? All of us to be like Dorothy Day, all of us to be Catholic workers? No. But if, there's like, 35 million Catholics in the United States, if we could get 1% of them to be
Yeah,
Catholic worker
right,
types,
right,
we would light this church on fire,
right.
transform it. And likewise, if we could get 1% of educated lay Catholics to be Philadelphia's drain, uh, then we could we could have all kinds of drains
Right.
everywhere. And it would be so. In other words, yeah, everybody doesn't have to do everything, but if we reach a critical mass of people who are willing to get their boots in the mud, we
Mhm.
can change things. We really can.
Yeah. And there are signs of that, by the way. I mean, the USCCB is ramping up this implementation of this office of the catechist. So there's going to be, it's
Yeah.
going to look different in every diocese and archdiocese, but there's going to be more defined pathways that are going to be better for the more syllabus minded among us. Um, but yeah, don't underestimate, especially if you've got that. You know, I think about the numbers, the sheer amount of people who I hear are theology majors at Steubenville every year, just to name one example. The amount of those people, and it's good, but it's also sad to me to see how many of them spin out to start their own little apostolate when your chancery is understaffed and everybody there is approaching
Yeah.
retirement. And you know, there are ways to really channel. I just want to hammer home in service of the bishop because that's where the church is going to be no matter what. And whatever structures have to change and grow around that. But obedience to the local bishop, that's always been the through line throughout the church for like you channel your sanctification in your marriage and obedience to the local bishop, local ordinary, and so on. So I just can't endorse that. And believe me, there's um, I mean, the presence of bureaucracy is thick, but that's why you're needed there. Yeah.
Yeah, gute Leute muss man haben. Gute Leute.
Yeah.
Personnel is policy.
Yep.
Anyway, let's end it there. Unless you have any last pithy comments or words you want to leave with us.
Anything I left unsaid, I'll say more fully when Saving Finite Freedom debuts from Whitford in, I don't
Oh,
know,
can't wait for that. That's going to be great. And
should
I
be fun.
wish you all the luck in writing it. And
Thank you. Thank you.
thanks Danny for being here, and thanks everyone for listening.
My
Bye
pleasure.
now.